Welcome to the fourth screencast describing how to use NCTR's new program finance tool. If you haven't already viewed the first three screencasts, which cover how to populate the tool for new programs, please view them first. Also, this screencast refers to a Word document, the analysis for new program training. It's available on the portal, and if you haven't printed a copy yet, please pause the screencast and do so now. This fourth screencast discusses how to interpret the financial sustainability of a program based on the inputs entered. To guide this analysis, we're going to move from the Inputs tab to the Outputs tab. The Outputs tab is organized into four parts. The first is the Overview, and the Overview section includes tables highlighting net income on the left and the additional fundraising required on the right. These figures do not include in-kind contributions or tuition, since those funding lines actually aren't part of a Lee Partners quote-unquote bottom line. Number two, financial sustainability of Lee Partner, shows program performance on each of the four metrics we've identified for financial sustainability: revenues versus expenses, variable revenues versus variable expenses, recurring revenues versus recurring expenses, and funding diversity. Section 3, Other Statistics of Interest, offer just that. For example, how much does the whole program cost, finally including tuition and in-kind contributions? That's graph A. What's the cost value to the resident? How does program staffing look in relation to the number of residents? And what are the fixed costs per resident? The last piece is the detailed forecast, which is a 5-year budget, and all of the revenue information appears on the left-hand side, and all of the expense information appears on the right-hand side. So we have all of these very cool looking graphs, right? The question then is, what do we do with them, and how do we use the information in this tab to answer our key questions? So in considering how to use the data, it's important to start with clear goals. And the Design for Impact initiative that NCTR has done focuses on two questions in particular. One, how can we measure the program's financial sustainability? And two, how can we improve the program's financial sustainability? With respect to the first goal, measuring the program's financial sustainability, we developed a table and some benchmarks to guide us through the analysis, which are on the worksheet you should have in front of you. Here's how we completed it. First, I like to make sure that the value here in this yellow cell is set per resident. The other option is to show all costs as total program costs. I like using per resident because it makes it easier to see the differences from year to year, controlling for the number of residents. And this is actually the only thing users can change in this tab. Everything else auto-populates based on the data entered into the Inputs tab. The next thing I like to do is scan the data and poke around a little bit. So for example, I can see in graph 2A, right, that the funding gap shrinks and then it kind of grows again. I can see that in the gray bars, but also if you look here in the net income row of the table below it. So it shrinks and then it gets much larger in 2020-21, and then it starts to shrink again. So then the question I'm asking myself is why? And to answer that question, I'm going to scroll down to the detailed budget to see what might be changing. So I'm actually going to start on the expense side, the right. And what I can see is that the expenses go up a little bit from 18 to 19, then it goes back down again, and then up a little bit in 21, 22. And as I scroll down and try to figure out why that's the case, I could see that the cost for many FTEs is going down year after year as the number of residents increases. The only one we're seeing consistent is for that coach. We talked about that during an earlier screencast, and that's because the number of coaches scales, meaning that we hire more, the program hires more coaches as the number of residents increases. But overall, the forecast for staff expenses goes down consistently year after year. As we scroll down further, though, there's a couple of nuances that cause sort of the ups and downs on the expenses. Most of the expenses are fixed, so just like those fixed staffing positions, the per resident amount decreases year after year until we hit our scale of 60 residents. And that's because the total amount spent won't change, but we're dividing by more residents over time. The only areas that's different is this training events for residents. You can see that's consistently $500 per resident. Again, that's because it's a variable expense, meaning that when we add a new resident, we still have to add that $500. But what's key here is that it's not increasing or decreasing, it's staying steady. So that doesn't explain why our expenses would go up at a couple of points. Where we do see kind of a much bigger jump is here on the consultants for post-residency support. So it's post-residency support. That means in year one, there are no residency graduates, and this line item costs our program exactly $0. But then looking ahead, you can see that it costs a minimum of $1,200 and as much as $1,500. And if you're scratching your head trying to figure out, well, why isn't just the same amount year after year? The answer is that there's a little bit of a delay in how we make this calculation. We're dividing by the number of residents that year, but the number of residency graduates lags a little bit. So remember, we start with 40 residents, and then we go up to 60 residents. Sorry, let me actually scroll up on my sheet and double check here. So we have 40 residents, then 50 residents, then 60 residents. So this $1,200 reflects 40 residents times $1,500, but then divided by the 50 residents that are participating that year. Similarly, this number for 2021 includes $1,500 for the 50 residency graduates from 1920, but then we're dividing that amount by the 60 residents that enrolled in 2021. And then moving forward, it's always 1,500 because the number of residency graduates matches the number of residents. So we're trying to understand why, going back up again, why our expenses, went a little too far there, why our expenses go up and then go back down a little bit. It's because mostly from that post-residency support the program starts offering in year 2, and then the fact that the number of residency graduates will scale over time. But the expense side of the equation is just half. Let's look at the other side on the revenues. And what we see here is that there is a little bit of there's a decrease for a couple of years and then a little bit of an increase. As we scroll down, we can see one reason for the decrease in revenues is that we have these fixed grants that run out. First, the demo site grant runs out in 1920, and then the NCTRC grant runs out in 2021. But beginning in 1920, we also get a new revenue line, that resident training fee, which is a fee that resident graduates pay once they start teaching. And just like we saw for the postgraduate support, that value kind of increases until the number of resident graduates equals the number of residents for that year. So all that's to say, we now have a better sense of why there's some ups and downs in terms of revenues and expenses over time. Another thing that I like to look at before I start answering too many questions is the overall cost per resident. And as I scroll down and take a look at that, it's in section 3A. You can see that that cost is somewhere between $71,000 and $72,000 in 2022-23. And that's about $7,000 higher than the median program we studied, as a total economic cost of just under $65,000. However, part of the reason ATR's total economic cost is so high is that the program has an incredibly high benefits rate, making ATR's stipend and benefits package one of the most expensive in the network. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. But now that I have a sense that's going on, my next step is to complete the sustainability metric table in the worksheet. So for new programs, financial sustainability will likely take time as programs scale. In other words, when the program reaches scale, what will the various funding gaps be? So rather than focusing on the first 1 or 2 school years where the residency program is operating, we're going to use the data from 2022-23 to answer the questions. So first, how do expenses compare to revenues? As I mentioned a little while ago, there's a gap about $7,000 or 15%. And you can figure out that 15% by subtracting this percentage in the bottom line, revenues as a percent of expenses, from 100. So that's not great, but it's also not awful. It's right around the cutoff of where we start to worry, which is around that 15 to 20% range. So as for variable funding, to the right, there's a gap here too. It's a little bit smaller than the overall funding gap at around $3,700 per resident, representing about 8% of all variable expenses. Again, not great, especially since it means when there's a variable funding gap, it means that each new resident adds to the total program cost, undermining the financial benefits of scale. But it's also not terrible. Again, we're well within that 15% range. And then scrolling down to C2, recurring revenues versus recurring expenses, we see that the entirety of the funding gap we saw in that first graph, that's 69.54, it's also here in the recurring revenues. So same story there. In terms of funding diversity, which is the last graph in this section, we can see that district funding makes up the vast majority of funding, though residents also pay a fee. And that's good, but it's not great. Ideally, we'd like 1 or 2 other sources to also contribute to funding. So ATR is not positioned to become financially sustainable given its current budget, at least not over the next 5 years. The question then is, how do we get it there? But for that, we're going to need another screencast. So I'll see you in number 5.